Hello everybody, this is Miss Peachy from your WCA Biology B class, and we are looking here at a new unit, Unit 4, Lesson 2. The classification of living things is the first lesson in this unit, and it's a long one, but it's not like super difficult, so I think that you guys will be doing okay with this. This video, however, might be just a bit longer because there's quite a few sections to go through. As always, there is a study guide that goes along with it, ladies and gents. It is in the link below the video on my website. So make sure you have access to my school website, and then you can click on that link to access your study guide. In this first section of Lesson 2, we are looking at the keywords botanist, paleontologist, systematists, which is also known as a taxonomist, and the word taxonomy. So we are studying the classification of living things. What we're going to be looking at is how this classification system has changed through time and many different modifications to it, and I'm sure there still will continue to be many different modifications to it as time goes on as well. One thing I'd like to start off with talking about, however, is how classification in and of itself is a human construct. And what I mean by that is that as human beings, it's very natural for us to want to make sense of the world. You do this all the time, from the time you are born, throughout your entire life. And when we look at living things and the complexity and diversity of all living things on Earth, it's natural for us to want to make some sort of sense and put them in some sort of order. So classification system is a way for us to order and make sense of the natural world of living things, right? But because it's a system that human beings are imposing upon nature, realize that the categories that we invent to put these living things into sometimes are not perfect. So they don't perfectly work for all living things. There's always going to be some living things that are kind of outliers and don't neatly fit into the categories that we have made. Now, modern taxonomy deals specifically with trying to get living things grouped into categories that are of closest evolutionary relationship to one another. So those that are in the same category are more related to each other. In the past, taxonomists would often use categories that were based solely on how something looked. And that was a little bit misleading because sometimes looks can be deceiving. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on with today. Having enough categories is also extremely important. Here's our first example, and I don't think this is a great example at all, but it's giving you kind of an idea of classification. In this example, we group animals into two groups, vertebrates and invertebrates, and from there we can subdivide each of our group. Let's look at our vertebrates. We can divide them into warm-blooded or cold-blooded, but then we end up with a whole bunch of things that are warm-blooded. Bears and ostriches and tigers and peacocks and whales and eagles and a whole bunch of things that are cold-blooded. And they may or may not be very closely related to each other. So we really just didn't go far enough in this classification system. So throughout history, and you can read a little bit more about Greeks and how they classified, there's been a multitude of different types of classification systems. Like I said, it's very natural for humans. So this goes back for a very, very long time. It wasn't until the 1700s that we started using really what amounts to the ancestor of our modern day classification system, and we pretty much use a version of this even today. This is called the Linnaean system of classification, and it was developed in the 1700s by a Swedish botanist named Carolus Linnaeus. And he organized living things into large kingdoms of plants and animals, which he further divided into smaller groups. And this is kind of the order of things that he put classification into: phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species, which is something we still use today. For example, it gives us the example of human beings. Humans belong in kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, order Primates, family Homidae, genus Homo, and species Sapiens. And you can look at this here. Much more broad, all living things, right? excuse me, this is all animals, the kingdom, all the way to just our modern humans, which are Homo sapiens, which belong into this group here. Kind of giving us the idea that each group is subsequently getting more and more specific, right? So there are some limitations and some changes that have occurred to the Linnaean system since it was first kind of introduced. For example, Charles Darwin discovered a lot of different things in his voyages on the HMS Beagle. He discovered different relationships among living things, and then even in fossil evidence he discovered. And this also is going to influence modern classification system. The invention of certain technologies like the microscope, for example, also led to a greater understanding of how things are related to each other. And even more recently, we're discovering new relationships and new species. And so the classification system that we have even today is constantly being revised and changed. People who study taxonomy, those people are known as systematists, also known as taxonomists, which is what I actually learned. And it does say here that today, even though we have pretty much discovered all large species of organisms on Earth, that there are lots of smaller things, microorganisms and insects and stuff like that that we are still discovering. So there's a lot of new life on Earth, or I shouldn't say new life, but a lot of life on Earth that we have yet to discover. Paleontologists, they actually look at evidence in fossils. So there are species of animals and plants and stuff that have gone extinct that we still classify based on the fossils that they provide. Then we're moving on to like the next section of this lesson, and we've got our two words, systematists and taxonomy, which we actually kind of learned already here. And so taxonomy is very difficult sometimes because there is such a wide variety of living things, and sometimes those living things don't necessarily fit neatly into one specific category. Maybe there's some overlap, or maybe they just fall outside of the realm of the description of that particular category. They're using an example of organizing books on a bookshelf in the library. You know, that there's different genres, there's fiction and nonfiction, there's different genres in each of the different categories. Sometimes you get this book that kind of could fit in either or, right? Maybe it's a suspenseful horror movie, or horror book. So you're not sure to put it in the suspense category or should you put it in the horror category, because it kind of has characteristics of both of them. And so if you think of those types of things, those overlap and traits that you can see in the living world, then it might be difficult to figure out which category a living thing could belong to. So taxonomy is a system of naming and classifying based on similar characteristics. So like I said, in the past, we oftentimes use just visual or physical characteristics, but now we're looking at more evolutionary characteristics, inherited characteristics, right? They said in the past things had been miscategorized because we didn't really know as much. It uses an example of, let's see, I think it might be on a different slide, but they're talking a little bit about how it's just very difficult to categorize things sometimes. So there has been changes to the system over time. It does talk at the end of this particular slide about something called binomial nomenclature. And this has been used since the Linnaean system actually was introduced, and it's still used in modern times. And that is every living thing on Earth, every species of living things has a two-name name. That's called binomial nomenclature, two names, right? And that is the genus and the species, and that identifies that particular organism. So for humans, it is Homo sapien. That's what I am, a Homo sapien. Homo is genus, sapien is species. We capitalize genus, so H capitalized in Homo, and S is lowercase in sapien. So that is the rules about how to name an organism using binomial nomenclature. If you make the H lowercase or you make the S capital, it's incorrectly written. So just make sure you are writing those correctly in correct binomial nomenclature. So the biggest change we've seen in the classification system actually came about much more recently in the 1990s. They talk a little bit about other changes that have occurred throughout time, and they'll talk more about that in some slides coming up here as well. But in 1990, microbiologist Carl Woese developed a big change to taxonomy. Building off the Linnaean system, he proposed that a higher category be added. He called that category domains. So originally our highest category was kingdom. We had the kingdom Animalia, kingdom Plantae, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Protista, so we had all these kingdoms of living things. He added something higher than that, and that is domains. And this was based on the cells that were found in each of these groups. We have bacteria, we have archaea, and we have eukarya. So bacteria, these are just about everywhere. These are prokaryotic organisms, right? But they differ from archaea. And archaea is a different type of single-celled organism, also prokaryotic, but these are found specifically in these extreme environments. Sometimes we call them extremophiles, and we did talk about them in the last lesson of the previous unit. So our methanogens and our acidophiles, those fall into that category. So those two domains are all single-celled prokaryotic organisms. Everything else on Earth falls under eukarya. So your animals, your plants, your fungi, those are all eukarya. So these are they're not necessarily multicellular organisms, but they have eukaryotic cells to them, right? Eukaryotic cells, so that means they have a nucleus, they have organelles in them, and that's where all the rest of living things on Earth fall. It talks a little bit more about archaea here, and how archaea, again, live in these extreme environments. They are believed to be the most ancient of all living things on Earth. They're believed to be remnants of species alive during the Earth's early years when conditions were much less hospitable than they are today. They can live in some very extreme environments. Then he talks about eukaryotic organisms and our bacteria as well. And then we get into like the most narrowest type of classification, species, right? So from domain all the way down to species, species are going to be your most specific type of group. And it says here, for example, all humpback whales belong to the same species regardless of where they live. However, a basking shark and a humpback whale are two different species, even though they both live in the same area and they look a little bit alike. So here's your basking shark, here's your humpback whale. They do not belong to the same species, even though they kind of live in the same area and they have a similar appearance to them. We have to look beyond just appearances here. So now we have our more modern system here: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And we can say this is the same thing. Here's the whale. Here is our basking shark. Our whale is a mammal. Our basking shark is not. It's a fish. Belongs to the class Chondrichthyes, which is one of the class of fish. So that's what makes them kind of different from each other, right? We can still look at that binomial nomenclature though, and say that our basking shark is Cetorhinus maximus, and that is the binomial nomenclature for that one. And for our whale, it's Megaptera nova angeli, or angele. Okay. All right, and then it talks a little bit about a kind of a tool known as a dichotomous key. We looked a little bit at a dichotomous key when we first started kind of that first slide that we have. A dichotomous key helps to break a large group down into two groups in multiple steps until you end up with something that's all by itself. Now, I'm going to show you this dichotomous key in a moment, but I want to go back to that first slide here. Oops. because I want to show you this other one. So this is another example of a dichotomous key. Animals. You're dividing it into two groups. Our two groups are vertebrates and invertebrates. You take this group and divide it into two, warm-blooded and cold-blooded, and then it kind of stops becoming a dichotomous key at that point. You would have to keep going until you ended up at the level of species. You can also write out your dichotomous keys to make it look more like a step, I guess, different steps, and that's what they have. Is it? Oh, it's this slide. Down here. So step one, leaves are spiny. If the leaves are spiny, we go and we know that our category is Pinus tata. Are the leaves broad? If the leaves are broad, we go to step two. In step two, it says, does it have a single leaf? If so, go to step three. Or does it have many leaves? If so, go to step four. So each step is divided into like two groups. One of the groups might be a description and the other group might just be a classification, but you just keep going step by step until you arrive at the binomial nomenclature that identifies that specific organism. Okay, so that's what a dichotomous key is. And we'll practice those more in live lesson as well. All right, so then it moves us on to this next section. We have the same terms again, right? Okay, so we still have our systematics and taxonomy as vocab words in this section. And basically this section is just talking about how important classifying living things are, that this is kind of a way in which scientists can communicate with each other, right? So we all may speak different languages on Earth, but if we all agree on a common system of classification, it's easy to be able to make sure you're sharing that information globally. It talks a little bit about how we've identified and cataloged species. Only about a fraction of the species of organisms on Earth have been categorized. And it talks a little bit about those organisms here. It says scientists are still finding and describing different organisms. We certainly haven't identified everything on Earth at this point. And that we continue to add things and change things as we discover new information. For example, theories of evolution and natural selection have led to changes in the classification system. Discovery of genetics and DNA has led to changes in classification system. Two organisms might look a lot alike, but they might not actually be related to each other very well. Their DNA doesn't match, right? And so maybe they were put in a group in the past that looked because they looked alike, and now they're put in separate groups because we know that they're not as closely related as we thought they were. And of course, we now have better and better microscopes, so we can see even smaller and smaller things, which adds to our diversity of living things in the world as well. Let's see. It helps us to understand the place in the ecosystem. That's an importance of taxonomy. How, if we can classify all living things in an ecosystem, we can better understand the relationship of all living things to each other in that complex web that exists in ecosystems. Helps us to develop kind of new ways to combat pests and stuff in agriculture and to grow better harvests to feed our ever-growing population. There's just so many benefits to better understanding and classifying all living things on Earth. Also helps to better understand kind of the past as well as we start classifying living things and those that have gone extinct before us. It gives us a better sense of our history of the human species as well as our relationship to other species on Earth. And again, there's potential for new discoveries that may benefit mankind as well. So, for example, recent discoveries of grain species have made it possible to increase rice yields to feed more people on the planet. So there's so many different things that may arise from the science of taxonomy. In this next section, we have the keywords binomial nomenclature, clade, cladistics, and taxonomy. All right, so it talks first about how when you look at words like horse and dandelion and bacteria, we all kind of have a different mental image of what that might look like to you. But that mental image may be different from somebody else who's looking at the same word. That's what's known as a common name. And common names are nice for you talking to me and us talking to our family and stuff like that. But when scientists are referring to organisms, they do not want to use common names because common names can be misleading. What I call, say, for example, a cornflower might be very different than what you call a cornflower, right? So we want to then instead use scientific names. And scientific names is where we come across that binomial nomenclature again. It basically allows us to be very, very precise, make sure that we're all kind of speaking the same language, and that we are all in agreement to exactly what we're talking about. That's extremely important. Let's see here. So I'm just moving ahead a little bit because I want to get into, they're still talking about binomial nomenclature here. And they're giving kind of the history again of the modern classification system and domains and why we have them. And then this last section is referring to how kind of our how mapping genomes for different organisms has really kind of changing the face of taxonomy, right? By the 1990s, scientists discovered how to read DNA. Different organisms had their genomes mapped. And what we can see is how our DNA and how the DNA of other species compares to each other. For example, about 97% of all human genes are the same as those that are found in chimpanzees. So we can see how closely we are related to chimpanzees, and we can look at that as kind of a, a map to evolution, to how closely we were or had a common ancestor in the past, right? And so today, genetic scientists test different organisms and they can actually map out all of the different genes in different organisms, right? They can actually look at all the ATs, Cs, and Gs, and they can see the genomic or the DNA sequences of all these different organisms and see how many of those base sequences they have in common. And they're working on mapping genes and stuff within those organisms as well. So this is a brand new science by the name of cladistics. And cladistics is a little bit of a tweak when it comes to classification because cladistics specifically looks at how organisms are related to each other um, from an evolutionary standpoint. How long ago did those organisms share a common ancestor? So we're always looking at common ancestry. So when you think about common ancestors, think about, I think the easiest way to think about this is in terms of just humans, right? So if you look at yourself and how you're related to other people, so if you have the same parents, your siblings, and you have a very recent common ancestor, right? Maybe your cousins, your first cousins, you all share the same grandparents. So the common ancestor there goes back one more generation from your parents. Maybe you have like second cousins where you all have like the same great grandparents, but you don't share the same grandparents. It goes back one more generation. And you can kind of like keep looking at that. So if we trace our ancestry far enough back, we might be really distantly related to somebody who lives a couple towns away that potentially shared like our great 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 grandmother a long time ago, right? We're not closely related anymore, but we have a distant ancestor. So we're not as closely related. So the study of cladistics looks at how long ago did two species share the same ancestor. So we're talking not just about generations, but about millions of years oftentimes, right? So how long ago did was there an ancestor that would have given rise to two separate species? We look at something called shared derived characteristics. So these are characteristics that are hereditary, that are passed on from generation to generation, and it allows us to see commonalities that have been passed on throughout history. For example, an example of a shared derived characteristic would be an organism that has four legs, for example, or four limbs, right? We can look at a group of organisms that all share that four limbs in common. And we can historically trace that back to a certain time period where we start to see the emergence of all four limbs. Or giving birth to live young. That's a more recent derived characteristic. So there's not as many organisms that can give birth to live young as there are that have four limbs, for example. So these types of derived characteristics allow us to group organisms based upon if they share those common characteristics, and it gives us a sense of how long ago they shared a common ancestor. So this study of cladistics, we'll be looking more into it. It's a bit of a step above kind of your basic Linnaean system of classification, but it generally gives us more um, information, how organisms are not just related to those within the same group, but how they're related to those organisms in other groups as well. So that is pretty much the end of this lesson. Like I said, it's a long one. There's lots of information. Please read through it pretty carefully because there's stuff I wasn't going through in this recording, some kind of background information and things like that that I kind of glossed over that you'll be able to read through on your own. But I just wanted to highlight kind of those main ideas like I try to do in my videos. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or you can send me a webmail message. Otherwise, guys, I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.